Good evening. My name is Rebecca Blair. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the engagement specialist with Friendly House Elder Pride Services. We work to enhance the lives of LGBTQ plus older adults through education, advocacy, support, and community building services. Thank you for joining us tonight for part 3 of our Planning with Pride series, Final Disposition. Our intent with these presentations is to provide information about end-of-life needs, services, and options available from the mouths of professionals working in these areas. We hope that this opens up a community-wide conversation about death and dying, choice, and meaning. The organizers of this series all agree that the LGBTQ plus community of all ages needs better access to this important information. And to best facilitate that, we will be recording the presentation part of our program tonight to be shared later via Friendly House's YouTube page. We will stop recording after our presenters have finished, and then we will facilitate a conversation with the speakers tonight. Please feel free at any time during the night to type your questions into the Q&A area or the chat, which will be enabled later on, and we will read them for you. You can also raise your virtual hands during that time, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. Once you're able to address all the questions in the room, we'd love to open things up if you'd like to share any of your personal experiences with this topic. We're going to begin part 3's presentation tonight with Holly Pruitt. Holly Pruitt, she, her, is a longtime lesbian activist and organizer who for the past 12 years has served the community as a funeral and wedding celebrant, home funeral guide, death doula, and community death educator. She's a co-creator of the non-commercial public information site, Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, and recently led a year-long community remembrance project, No on 9 Remembered, which was featured by the American LGBTQ Plus Museum. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I'm going to share a little bit more of what drew me into this work during session 4 later in June, where we focus on ceremony. But for tonight, I'm just really thrilled to welcome 2 colleagues and members of the LGBTQ community here in Portland, Jillian Fitzhugh and Patrick Cornelius. And both of you, would you please tell everyone a little bit more about you and what drew you into funeral service?
Well, I'll start. My name is Jillian Fitzhugh. I use they, them pronouns. I presently work as the managing director of Riverview Cemetery Funeral Home, which is on the grounds of Riverview Cemetery. Prior to becoming a funeral director, I was working in the natural foods industry. I was and am still extremely passionate about locally grown foods, sustainable agriculture, education, and increasing my community's access to healthy foods. One day I read an article about the natural burial movement in the United Kingdom, and it was kind of like a light bulb went off in my mind. I was spending all of my time thinking about, making healthier choices and getting my community on board with making healthier choices as well. But I never gave any thought to what happened after we pass away. So I couldn't find any green burial resources in my home state of Maryland. So I started looking elsewhere to find a place where not only green burial was prevalent, but where I might also be able to go to mortuary school. And so here I am in Portland now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Cornelius. My pronouns are he, his, and I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer in Oregon, and I'm also a cremationist. I've been in the industry for about 8 years. And it's a second career for me. I was involved completely opposite. I worked in elite disability sport for almost 20 years. It's opposite, but in the sense, I was also doing event planning. So it's kind of similar to the funeral industry. But growing up, I watched a family. My family is a pretty large family, and we utilized the same funeral home for all of my family. From like 5 years old on, I was always my parents didn't hide it from us. We went to traditional funerals. And this family is an African-American family, and one of the only ones in the area that ran this small business, and just always admired them and their compassion, their professionalism, how they just interacted with the community, seemed to know everybody. And that always stuck with me. But it wasn't until maybe around 2012 or so that I decided that I wanted to look into switching careers and going into the industry. So moved to Portland to go to school, and found out my plan was to just work with families and guide them through services. But then going to school, I found out that you had to learn both sides of the industry. And then once you graduated, you could make a decision if you wanted to go one way or the other, or do both. And I actually fell in love with the other side. I love both, but I fell in love with the body preparation side of things. And so it's an art in my mind, in my opinion, and it's a constant challenge for me. And I've recently been working to advance my techniques and more of the reconstruction side of preparation, because I want to be able to provide the opportunity for families that are told this, you shouldn't see your loved one, or you can't see your loved one, or they're too far gone. And there are ways, there are people out there that are able to do it if that's what families want. But I'm also very open to, if families want the minimal thing done, just however we can help families say their last goodbyes, however they want to do that, is kind of my passion. But yeah, so I'm happy. I met Holly right when I finished school. And over the years, I was always like, how can I get involved with the community? Because I was starting to work with families and sort of, find out that people really don't know what to do, or when you have a chosen family, there's laws and things that people aren't prepared for. And so I would always bug Holly for years of like, what can we do? What can we do? So I'm very grateful that Holly asked me to be a part of this, and I finally get the opportunity, and hopefully I can share some tidbits to pique your interest or gain information, or at least push you to really think about what do I want, and start preparing a little bit.
Thanks, Patrick. And actually, Patrick and I met at a showing at Cinema 21 in Portland of the amazing documentary Homegoings. That was part of a series of discussions, monthly movie nights that I hosted for 3 years on death and dying. And it's about the amazing tradition of service of Black-owned funeral homes within the Black community. And a mutual friend, Reverend Cecil Prescott, said, well, you got to meet. We got one right here, Patrick. And Jillian and I also entered into my passion for community funeral advocacy through an article about green burial that was in People magazine. And a friend of mine said, if this is in People magazine and it's featuring a conservation burial ground in South Carolina, why isn't this happening in Portland? And so we set about thinking we might open a green burial cemetery, and instead found a variety of other niches, since there were other operators doing that. So Rebecca, if you could put up the first slide, I'll provide an overview of what the three of us cooked up for this presentation tonight. So I think Rebecca's going to screen share a few slides for us. Thanks, Rebecca. So we're going to start at the end point, the very inelegant term for what happens to your body after your death. It's called final disposition is the legal term. So we're going to provide an overview of those options in Oregon. And you saw some of them at the opening poll, with a deeper dive into some of those greener options and cremation, because, well, that's what we saw the most interest in. And then we're going to back up and say, okay, what about everything that happens from that time of final exhale to the place of disposition? And that's the role of the funeral services practitioner, like the two here with us tonight, but also we can handle these functions ourselves as family and designated community members. So we'll talk about that. We want to touch base on a couple of scenarios of specific concern to our community around death certificate, the appointment of a person to handle your disposition if you don't want it to be the next of kin, and unattended death when a death occurs, you're not on hospice or in the hospital. And then we want to wrap up with how to get what you want and only what you want when working with a funeral director, or also if you're working directly with a cemetery or a cremation or other disposition provider. And of course, then time for questions and discussion. So Rebecca, if you can go to the next slide, one of the things that we want to do in our presentation is show you where to find this information for yourself, because there's going to be a lot that we're going to share with you, more than most people would want to absorb in a single session. Rebecca mentioned that I'm the co-founder of a non-commercial public information website, Oregon Funeral Resources and Education. All of the content on it was vetted by the state medical examiner, by some very long-time funeral directors and cemetery managers, and it's been the basis of a lot of professional education with hospital departments, the State Chaplains Association, and others. And we have replicated this site for Washington. It's based on a model created in New Hampshire, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, which is also a great national resource for us. So Rebecca, if you could stop screen sharing, and I'm going to take you live now to the site, and you can just see the home page. And really what I want to focus on here is the how-to menu that I've just dropped down. You can see there's a lot of detail for almost every aspect of what we might talk about here, but I'm going to go to how to arrange disposition. And this is just an overview of all of the different forms of disposition. So cremation, Patrick's going to take you a little bit behind the scenes, but this just provides the terminology of some of the different ways that cremation is available to consumers, the different ways that it's packaged, some things to think about with the disposition of cremated remains and environmental impact. And then some of the greener forms that Jillian's going to talk about: alkaline hydrolysis, natural organic reduction. We'll talk about all the different names for that. Green and natural burial, conventional cemetery burial. A lot of detail if you're a military veteran or you have a loved one who's a military veteran. Home burial is actually legal in Oregon if you meet certain stipulations, so there's more info there. Burial at sea is an option, and then some people donate their bodies to science or want to make sure that organs and tissue can be donated, so a little bit of what to look for there. So that was just a really fast and furious kind of overview. I also want to show you that under the Learn More tab, we have a really extensive glossary that has all of these terminologies of final disposition options, all the different types of cemeteries, all the different types of ceremonies, all the different types of helping professionals, and so forth. So that's something that you might want to browse at another time, oregonfuneral.org, and Rebecca's going to be sharing the links. I'm going to stop sharing and ask Rebecca to put the slides back up and turn it over to Jillian to start going into some detail.
Okay, thank you so much, Holly. So we're going to be talking about green burial first. So in its most basic terms, I'm sure many of you know that green burial or natural burial is the burial of remains without embalming, without the use of a vault or outer burial container. And the remains are generally placed into a casket or container such as a shroud that's meant to biodegrade naturally. So here on the screen, you'll see the three different types of green burial cemeteries, kind of in order of least to most greenness. So in a hybrid cemetery, both green burial and conventional burials are allowed. Some cemeteries like Riverview allow for natural burial in every section of the cemetery. Others like Mount Calvary Catholic Cemetery in Northwest Portland have a designated green burial section, but allow for conventional burial only throughout the rest of the cemetery. Here in the middle is a natural burial ground, which is sort of the next step up in terms of greenness. So a natural burial ground is a cemetery that is fully dedicated to green burial. The Forest Conservation Burial Ground in Ashland is an example of a local natural burial ground. They're also the only lesbian-owned cemetery that I know of in Oregon. And I think that they're in the process actually of becoming a conservation burial ground. So a conservation burial ground is the greenest type of cemetery. A conservation burial ground must partner with a conservation organization to provide perpetual conservation of the land. There's also requirements about the density of the number of burials within the cemetery. The Conservation Burial Alliance suggests that there be no more than 300 burials per acre, while in a traditional conventional cemetery, that number may be upwards of 1,000 burials per acre. So White Eagle Memorial Preserve, which is outside of Goldendale, Washington, is an example of a local conservation burial ground. Their graves typically measure 20 feet by 20 feet, so that you can be buried in accordance with the natural landscape, so as not to disturb plants and root systems. And I do just want to draw your attention to the website listed there at the bottom of the screen. There's so much information about natural burial on that website. They have a pretty exhaustive list of cemeteries throughout the US and Canada that allow for natural burial. So if you have any interest at all in green burial, definitely do check them out. And then also one note about cemetery certification. So to my knowledge, there's only one organizational body that certifies, green burial cemeteries, as well as funeral homes and caskets and urns and the like, and that is the Green Burial Council. So you can also check them out. They've got a lot of good resources on their website too. And I should mention that I do volunteer work for them as well. But just because the Green Burial Council haven't certified a particular cemetery doesn't mean that that cemetery isn't worth exploring. There can be any number of reasons why a cemetery may not opt to go through the certification process with the Green Burial Council. The cemetery may not perform enough interments to justify the expense, or they may not find the certification necessary. And then with some religious cemeteries, some religions restrict the type of marketing that they're allowed to do. So, definitely do take a look at that website at the bottom of this page. Rebecca, if I could have you go on to the next slide, please. Okay, and so alkaline hydrolysis. So alkaline hydrolysis is referred to by many names. It's also referred to as aqua cremation, water cremation, flameless cremation, or in our state, it can be referred to as dissolution. So in alkaline hydrolysis, what happens is that the body is placed into a vessel along with water and a chemical solution. What remains following this process is very similar to flame cremated remains, though there may be a higher volume of remains than with flame-based cremation, maybe about 20% more. So aquacremation has been touted as a more environmentally friendly method of disposition than a traditional flame-based cremation, because it doesn't rely on the use of natural gas to power the machinery. It's said that the amount of water that is used in this process is equivalent to the amount of water used in a shower. The water used in this process, which is also called effluent, is safe for our public sewer system. While this seems like new technology, this process has actually been in use as a method of disposition since 2011, and it was actually first developed in 1888 for use in agriculture. And so then with natural organic reduction, I get calls about this all the time. So I'm still learning a lot about it, and I hear new information about it every day. So it's sort of like an expedited green burial. Your remains are placed into a specialized container and are reduced to soil ultimately. So depending on the process involved, this can take anywhere from 1 to 4 months. As this is new technology, there are a variety of proprietary vessels being used, which I think explains the variable timeline for that process. And while natural organic reduction is now legal in Oregon, there is no one physically offering this service in Oregon. I checked with the Oregon Mortuary and Cemetery Board last week to see if anyone had submitted paperwork to kind of run one of these facilities, and they told me no one had as of yet. So there are several providers that are currently operating in Washington state, however, but I would suggest doing your research if you do want to select, one of those providers. Because as this is new technology, there's sort of a variety of providers ranging from those on the DIY or do-it-yourself end of the spectrum to the kind of tech money backing end of the spectrum. Surprisingly enough, it seems a little odd to me that there'd be tech money in funeral service, but there is. So many of these providers, you're also going to want to ask a bunch of questions of, because sometimes these providers will charge you extra fees to be able to take you up to Washington for this process. And then also it's worth investigating how to have the soil that is produced transported back to you. I've heard that what the yield of soil that is generated is approximately 1 cubic yard. So basically what would fit in the bed of a pickup truck. So some providers may only mail you essentially an urn's worth of soil. So if you are wanting more of the soil that is produced, you're going to have to, arrange to have it brought back to Oregon for you. Okay. And so the next thing I'll talk about is greenwashing, because greenwashing is very, very, very prevalent in the funeral industry at this time. I'm sure that you all have seen or heard of the mushroom suit, also called the infinity burial suit. It made the news a few years ago when actor Luke Perry was buried in one. So what it is a suit made of mushrooms and organic cotton, and it's designed to encase the body to speed along the natural process of decomposition. But what they don't tell you is that soil actually does the same thing. With green burial, there's always a layer of nutrient-rich soil that's placed into the grave as well. So there's no real need for this mushroom suit, in my opinion. And there's also no evidence that suggests that the mushroom suit will accommodate a faster or cleaner decomposition as well. And then I know that there's a variety of companies out there that manufacture some sort of urn that on the bottom has cremated remains and the top has a tree sapling or tree seeds. And they have this claim that they're making that the tree seeds can be nourished by the cremated remains. Anytime I see these products, I get kind of skeptical because these products are pretty much always an example of greenwashing. Cremated remains have a high pH level, which inhibits plant growth. So quite literally, the cremated remains stop a plant from accessing the nutrients that are found in soil. And then along the lines of shades of green, there's definitely, as I mentioned, levels of green burial. So, not everybody wants to be buried in a shroud in the forest, and that's okay. Just because you want to be in an existing family plot or buried in the city so that your friends and community are able to visit you more easily doesn't mean that your choices are less valid. Just because you want to be buried in, something that's not 100% biodegradable, like you can still do that. That's very reasonable to do. So I just think that the important takeaway is, making choices for yourself that align with your values. Okay. And so next I'll hand things off to Patrick. Patrick will be talking with us in great detail about cremation.
Thanks, Jillian. So Jillian, Rebecca, you can go ahead to the next slide. Jillian mentioned aquamation, and I'm going to talk about flame-based cremation, which is more what people are familiar with, or so I guess the more popular form of cremation at this point in time. And so for flame-based cremation, that process, so on the left-hand side is a picture of a crematory, the chamber. And the process of cremation takes anywhere, it's reduction by flame, and the temperatures reach anywhere from 1400 to 1600 degrees. And the process is anywhere from 30 minutes to could be 3 to 4 hours. And it really depends on the size of the person that's being cremated. For the 30 minutes would be more of maybe a stillborn, because there's not much bone or cartilage there. And so that's a shorter process on up to an adult. And then depending on how much the adult weighs or what container the adult is in will determine the length of time that it will take for the process to be completed. So to start the process, you have to be placed in some type of minimum container. Rebecca, if you could go ahead and switch to the next slide. So a minimum container, the top left corner is basically a cardboard box. But if you remember the slide we just saw of the chamber, it's a narrow chamber, a little bit wider than that box. So if you think about it, you have to be in something to go in, because otherwise you're almost being rolled into the chamber. So the minimum container is the basic option. To the right there is a container called a viewing tray. So sometimes people may want to have some type of minimal viewing and they don't want to be in the plain cardboard box. So the minimal tray is a cardboard box, but it has a pillow in it and a liner and a lid. Another option is the bottom left-hand corner is what's called a rental casket. So a rental casket, if somebody wants something more traditional to have their loved one in a casket, but not pay for an entire casket to be cremated, then they can use the rental casket. And if you look on that top picture, both pictures kind of behind the casket, the bottom end of the casket opens, and then that container comes out, and that's what's cremated. Just that, and the lining is all. So it's a whole new insert that comes in when someone else uses the casket, but that's all that is cremated. Prior to that process, I mean, especially looking at the minimum container sometimes, and I know this will probably be talked about with Holly with our next session, but sometimes family members want to decorate that, and you can do kind of all, it's basically cardboard. You can write on it, leave notes, but families can place letters in with their loved one, pictures, mementos. We talk about when you sign the cremation authorization, if somebody has a pacemaker, that has a battery in it. So that has to come out in advance. And if you've ever seen anyone with a pacemaker, it's very superficial. And so the funeral director removes that pacemaker. But if they have other items in their body that have batteries in them, like sometimes people have like a baclofen pump or something like that, that's deeper in the body, we don't remove that, but just the pacemaker. But anything else, like if somebody's had a hip replacement, knee replacement, sometimes even buttons or zippers on clothing, fillings in teeth, any of those metals that don't go through the process, they may, once at the end of the process, those metals will melt, some of them will be intact, and then families are welcome, because they have to be separated from the remains. Families are welcome to take those items, or they'll be recycled with a medical recycling company through the funeral home. But to back up a little bit, at the end of that process, once the machine cools down and the door is open, what basically is left is more the outline, basically the skeletal remains, and it's more brittle bone. And that so as the remains are removed from the crematory, they do break up a little bit. Some of them are still in shape, and you can really look at bones and see what they are if you're familiar with a skeletal system. But those are removed from the crematory. They're then placed into a cooling tray. They're allowed to cool, and then the next process is called pulverization, and that's basically taking the remains down to more of a finer sand / powder form, and then placed into the container of your choice. The bottom right-hand corner is a basic plastic urn, but remains can go into anything. I mean, it's totally up to the family. You don't have to buy an urn from the funeral home. I've had families use cookie jars, wine bottles, alcohol, liquor bottles, tackle boxes, anything that means something to you, that's that says something about your family member, you can have the remains placed in. We will usually in containers like the one on the bottom right hand corner, we'll use a plastic liner just as a protection inside that container. But I mean, you can tell the funeral director what you want. We can also divide the remains up into small little baggy portions for family, or family can do that. They don't have to have the funeral home do that. But it's an option. But really you're thinking about, what do I want to do with those remains next? So are they going to be scattered? Are they going to stay at someone's home? Are they going to be placed in jewelry? Glass items can be made. Some people use them for tattoos. There's so many things you can do with the remains. Are they going to be buried? Are they going to be placed into what's called a niche wall or columbarium, into a wall? I guess really your container, one depends on what you want, and then what you want to do with them. And then sometimes it also depends on what the rules of, if you're going to place them at a cemetery, what the rules of the cemetery happen to be. At the end, and the next thing I want to talk about are a process that you can be involved in. So Rebecca, thank you, Rebecca. Go ahead to the next slide. You can be, if families can be a part of the cremation process, and it's what's known as a witness cremation. This picture here is kind of a pretty elaborate setting where there's chairs and there's a glass window and you can see everything. The facility where I work, you're literally in the room. There are no chairs. Everybody just kind of stands around, and families have an opportunity to say their last goodbyes. They can place those items at that time if they want to, and then they can be involved as much as they want in the process. So, families are able to go ahead and push the remains into the crematory, close the door, and then Rebecca, if you go back to slide 7, like 2 more back. There on the right is the control panel, and then you are also able to go ahead and start the machine. Most families at this point, after that point, they're pretty much done with the process. However, I have worked with families that stay through that entire, 2, 3, 4 hours. But really, at that point, you're just kind of sitting and waiting for the process to finish. But you can, one of the things I wanted to say is the crematory. It's not the most comfortable place. So you would think the crematory's on, it's hot. It would be, warm in the winter and warm in the summer, but the room, at least where ours is not weatherized. So it's actually freezing in the winter time because there is no insulation in the building, except when the door is closed, it's freezing in there. And then in the summer, it's stifling hot because of the temperature outside, and it also takes the machine a lot longer to cool down. So sometimes the cremation process may take a little bit longer in the summertime, just purely because it's so hot outside and we're waiting for the machine to cool down. We work a lot at the funeral home where I am, we work a lot with Buddhist communities, and that's part of their tradition to have a service and then witness the cremation. So everyone will come in at the end of the service, they'll process in. The monks will be present and do some prayers and chants, and then then there's a process of the family helping to place their loved one or witness their loved one go into the crematory. Other families do it as well. I would say it's just more for us, more frequently, it's the Buddhist community, but lots of people, want to do that. Some people are like, you know what, I want to make sure my loved one is the one that's in the crematory. I want to make sure those are my loved one's remains that I'm getting back. And so some people just purely do it just to be sure that that's their loved one. We're only cremating one person at a time, but you can tell people all of this, but sometimes people are like, I just want to know, and that's totally fine. We're not hiding anything. We will walk people through the process and let them know that, in the state of Oregon, everyone that dies in the state of Oregon gets an identification tag, and that tag stays with them throughout the whole process. Once they're in the crematory, if you look at the picture on the left, the top right corner, there's a clasp, and that all of their paperwork and that number will be right there. The crematory where I used to work, we would put the number right inside that front right corner of the crematory. Again, just to, making sure that that is always with them throughout the whole process. And so again, we'll explain that through to folks, but sometimes people just want to see it, and that's totally okay. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Holly, and she's going to talk about acting as your own funeral service provider.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick and Jillian. So we'll go to slide 10 now, Rebecca. Thanks. And just a note about terminology. I think I speak for all 3 of us in saying when we use the term family member and family, we mean it in the most broadly inclusive way. Chosen family. We often refer to a loved one. Sometimes we have to care for people in death or after death that might not even have been a loved one. It might have been a difficult relationship, but maybe we're bonded through community as well, or through biological family. Now, when it comes to the legal definitions of family and who has legal rights, we'll be coming back to that. But from our perspective, when we're talking about how we care for each other, it's in all the ways that we define family and community. So we're going to work our way back now from the final disposition pieces, the range of options that Jillian and Patrick have just talked us through, back to the final exhale and the time of death. Now, for some of us during that period of time, there might not be anything that you would call a funeral, and the body could just go straight to disposition. And this was the case for my father, for example, died at home under hospice care. The removal service came and took his body away in a body bag about an hour after his death. And then 6 weeks later, I got a portion of his ashes in a yogurt container, along with some of his effects. And there was no memorial, no funeral of any kind. And like I said, that's part of what we might talk about at our final session about ceremonies and ceremonies that never happened. But for every culture and civilization that's been studied throughout time, 3 things have been found in common relating to death and the disposition of the dead. There has always been some kind of funeral rites, rituals, or ceremonies. There's always been a sacred place for the dead and memorialization of the dead. And this actually goes back 60,000 years BC to Neanderthal burial sites that have been found with antler and flower fragments next to the corpse, indicating some kind of rituals and gifts of remembrance. It's really only in contemporary North America that we're now seeing deaths that occur without any ceremony or memorialization, without any sense of sacred place, for example. And sadly, Jillian and Patrick could both tell you about ashes that aren't even picked up. Right? Now, rewinding 2 centuries ago, until the 19th century, funerals were always family and church or synagogue or mosque or community affairs, that there were always family or community members or honored people from the community, elders or other people with some spiritual standing in the community that would have the care of the body to lay it out and dress or drape it. And a coffin would be built by the local carpenter, or they would make it themselves. That's a lost art that some people are rediscovering. And then in North America, the viewing or the wake, the visitation happened in the front parlor. And only after funeral homes or funeral parlors replace this function did we have the modern invention of what I'm sitting in now, a living room. We don't have parlors in our home anymore. We have a place for living, right? So even though we have had a rise of professionalized death care to where that has become the norm, it's licensed and regulated for some very good reasons, it is totally legal for families and community to care for their loved ones at home or in community settings, even from death to disposition, as long as you know what you're doing. This is sometimes called a home funeral, a funeral that's conceived and conducted by the family and their wider community. But we're going to open up the definition a little bit today to talk about a continuum with all of the different functions. So on one end, you can think of, any kind of image that might come to your mind about a home funeral. At the other end, everything being handled by a funeral home in a conventional way, and then the blend of what might happen in between. So we'll go to the next slide to start looking at how we might think about this. So I like this definition from home funeral advocates, including those that work in different community-based settings to increase community capacity for this. So a home funeral basically refers to a non-commercial family community-centered response to death that involves the family and its social community in the care and preparation of the body for burial or cremation or the other variations, and or in the planning and carrying out of related rituals and ceremonies, and or in the burial or cremation itself. So lots of options there. And it might occur in the home, but it might not. There might be other settings, but it's differentiated from the institutional funeral because there is minimal non-invasive care and preparation of the body. As Patrick said, there may be very good reasons for embalming and restoration. It's an important part of a number of cultural traditions and very healing for many people. And other people prefer to take a more natural and non-invasive and do-it-yourself approach to that. It's also characterized by reliance on the family's own social networks for assistance and support, which is what in the LGBTQ community we're really used to doing, is figuring out ways to do for our own. And there may be a relative absence of commercial funeral providers. But let's take a look at really breaking down in the next slide what this means. So the reality is that for those who want to be hands-on in some type of way, and you've already heard some examples from Jillian and Patrick, and we'll talk about more, it can end up being meaningful. It can be healing. It can help integrate the reality of the death into your lives because it slows the process down a little bit. It can offer the bereaved a sense of control and a sense of being useful, an anchor of stuff to do in a time that can feel very unmooring. And it can enable families and communities to create the kind of ambiance that really suits the person being honored and to decide how the body's going to be treated. And these can be issues that are particularly important for us as a community. That said, it takes a lot of preparation, organization, and determination to do it 100% on your own. And so having a partnership with a supportive funeral home, funeral director, or provider of where you're going to end up, if it's a cemetery, natural organic reduction, and so forth, it's really important. And that's why we're so fortunate to have Jillian and Patrick, who both work for independent, locally owned funeral home that they'll talk a little bit more about what that means to them and what that can mean to us. So let's talk about the different components of a funeral service practitioner role. And again, for the most part, these are handled by licensed, paid professionals. But if we pull back the veil and say, well, what is it that they're doing that actually we're legally entitled to do on our own as family or designated community person, as long as we're not paid, it basically comes down to care of the body, handling the paperwork, transportation of the body, and arranging final disposition. So for the body care, it can be as simple as bathing and dressing at home, but also in a hospital or care facility, or even at the funeral home. I'm sure Jillian and Patrick have both supported families where the body has come into their custody, but family members have come and undertaken that themselves. And then for other people, it's taken care of by the professionals. For the death certificate, there are legal requirements for a written report that has to be filed with the county registrar, and then the death certificate that has to be signed by a medical professional, and the clock is ticking on both of those. And almost all of that is filed through an electronic death registration system managed by funeral directors like Jillian and Patrick, who can then also get the signature of the medical authority electronically, submit it electronically. But we do have the right in both Oregon and Washington to get a hold of the actual paper death certificate. And it's got the old-fashioned carbon copy where one of the pages of it functions as your transportation permit and the other is the disposition permit. And they actually provide you with that metal identification tag, AKA toe tag. You get that from the state health department, the vital stats folks, and we've got all that information back on that website. You have to pretty much plan ahead. You can't just walk in and ask at the front desk for this packet to take care of. So it is possible to do that yourself. You can read stories on the website of people who've done it and the meaning they've found from that. But for the most part, it's going to be up to the family next of kin to complete the demographic section, and the funeral home will handle that. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some of the issues that our community might be of particular interest around in the death certificate piece. For the transportation, while it's most typical for a removal service to take care of the body going from the place of death to a funeral home where it will be in refrigeration, maybe for the body preparation, and then to cemetery, to the place for natural organic reduction, or the body may go directly to the place where it will be cremated. But it is legal for families to do that transportation themselves. And most people have a car that if you put the seats down, you'd be able to do it if it meant something to you to do that. And particularly if you're using an out-of-state provider for natural organic reduction, it might be something that you'd want to consider. And back on that website, OregonFuneral.org, you can find out a lot of tips for thinking about doing that transportation yourself. And a supportive funeral director could also provide you with some of those tips. And then lastly, in terms of disposition, it is possible to work directly with the cemetery, directly with a crematorium, directly with a provider of natural organic reduction without using an intermediary funeral home. They basically bundle the funeral director functions in. You cannot arrange an alkaline hydrolysis, a water cremation, without going through a funeral home at this point. There's not a direct to consumer kind of option for that. But many people also will have their funeral director facilitate those arrangements with the final disposition if provider, if it's at another place. You'll have to probably do separate legal contracts. But, Patrick already mentioned that you can be hands-on in decorating the container and negotiating, what the burial is going to take place in, or the other form of disposition. Funeral homes are legally required to accept caskets that you might purchase yourself. There's sort of a famous buy it at Costco sort of thing, but you have to work with each of them to find out, cemeteries will have different requirements. Every facility will have different requirements. But some of the most common ways that people historically have really found meaning in participating in the final disposition is as pallbearers, accompanying the body to burial, doing the witnessed cremation, as Patrick just described. In the case of burial, actually helping to close the grave. So that's just a kind of an overview of the range of options and ways that you can have a little bit more involvement while still relying on the services of a paid funeral service practitioner. So let's go to the next slide, where we want to dive a little deeper into the death certificate issue, because whether you were going to fill it out yourself or whether you're going to work with the funeral home to file it for you, it's really helpful to get all the information together in advance. And we're going to show you where you can actually download a copy of this death certificate worksheet. But Patrick, can you highlight a couple of things that particularly for the LGBTQ community, we're going to want to be aware of?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Holly. So this is a sample of the death certificate worksheet and some information that is going to be asked. Some of the things that will, for our community, which could be concerning or troubling for them, is name and gender identity. So for the name that matches your social security card is what is going to have to go on the death certificate, because they're linked into that electronic system that Holly talked about in notifying Social Security. However, there is, if someone, so say someone is, they have a chosen name, but they have not changed their name legally at this point, the next line under the name is the AKA, or otherwise known as. And that can be a spot where, this is, if you were doing, that's how you live, that's the name you lived under, but you just didn't do it legally, we can put it there. The next section is then, I can't remember how long it's been now, maybe 3 or 4 years now. Jillian and Holly, if you remember, that they've changed the gender identity markers. And it's the same with your license passport, but the choices are FM, undetermined, unknown, or X. So you have that option of, not being sort of, for lack of a better word, put into that box on these boxes and checking them off. So you do have a couple options, but then other things are just sort of being prepared. And this, as Holly said, you can get this form off of the website just to have this information maybe somewhere in a file. So, with our chosen family, we may not have contact with our birth families. And then it's time to fill out this death certificate, and maybe you all have never had a conversation about, what was my loved one's mother's name or father's name, parents' names, what was the maiden name, where were they born, information like that. So it's good to have this just tucked in a file, just so you have that information and you know what to put on it. Because the death certificate also becomes a historical document. And so I try to encourage people to have it as accurate as possible, but you certainly, we are able to put unknown in some of the boxes if that's information you just don't have, or maybe somebody for some reason doesn't want that information on there. We can put unknown, but again, we try to put it as we get it as accurate as possible. And the big things are the legal name as it's connected to the Social Security number. So that information can be relayed to Social Security. So I think that's pretty much what I mean. There's some other things on that death certificate we can talk about, even in the Q&A part, we can kind of talk about how many death certificates you need, what are they used for, fees for them. We can talk about that later, but just wanted to kind of highlight some parts on the death certificate now.
Thanks, Patrick.
Turn it back over to Holly.
Yeah, Rebecca, if we can go to the next slide. Here is an even more important form. So getting your information together that will eventually be on your death certificate is a kindness to the people who are going to have to provide that. But now let's talk about who will be providing that information. Jillian?
Yeah. So every week I hear from people who think that just because they've got a will in place that, the will ascribes certain rights to their executor, that it doesn't. So the will doesn't give people the automatic right to make funeral arrangements. In Oregon, there's a sort of hierarchy of right to direct disposition. So the executor of the estate or personal representative of the estate is usually 7th or 8th on that list. So that means that, if there's other biological family members or who are of a higher standing on that hierarchy, they have more rights than whoever you've appointed as the executor. So unless your will specifically states, I want this person to handle my funeral arrangements, and moreover states exactly what those funeral arrangements are, like I said, someone of a higher standing in that hierarchy of right to control disposition can just go ahead and make those arrangements on your behalf. So a good way that's a workaround, because in nearly every will I've ever seen, there's never that specific language in it that gives the right to direct funeral arrangements. The state has set up this appointment of persons form. So if you, it's super easy to fill out too. Essentially, you can appoint any one of your choosing. You just have to have it witnessed by 2 people who are not yourself or the person who's being appointed. And, you can keep this with your other important papers. So at the time that someone does pass away, you can just present this to whoever, whatever funeral provider you would be working with. So if you don't have family, if you're estranged from your family, if you're worried that your family doesn't respect your identity, or that their wishes for what would happen would be contrary to your own, I highly suggest that you fill this out. It's on the website. I think, Holly, were you going to take us there and show us? Awesome. Okay. So just remember, it doesn't need to be notarized, doesn't need to be filed with the court. It's just, a pretty simple form that just 2 witnesses need to witness you signing.
Great. Thanks, Jillian. Rebecca, let's go to the next page. Okay. We had one more slide, Rebecca, if you don't mind. And then we're going to be moving into the end of our presentation. So we just wanted to highlight again, finding more information. There's OregonFuneral.org, and then also NewHampshireFuneral.org. That's nhfuneral.org is where the green burial cemeteries in the U.S. and Canada are. And Rebecca, now if you can end, just wanted to give that visual so you can end the slideshow. And I'm going to go back to taking you to, on the website, how to complete paperwork. It's one of those how to pull downs. You can find the Oregon death certificate worksheet here. And then the appointment of persons form, we really wanted to call this out. So on the blog, we have a whole article on the importance of this for LGBTQ death care, featuring Linda Campbell and Nancy Lynchild's grave marker, very important to many of us. We'll talk more about that in fourth session. But this includes the appointment of person to make decisions concerning disposition of my remains form. I also want to show you briefly another blog post on medical certification of death that describes an 86-year-old woman. She was single. She was relying on family and friends. She lived with multiple sclerosis for 56 years. She had her physician order for life-sustaining treatment on her front door, her advance directive, completed everything that Jillian was kind of describing when we think that we have our affairs in order. That's a big accomplishment. And her friends and family knew she didn't want, any intervention. She had a stroke and died shortly thereafter. And so her friends and family were caring for her in the way that they'd always discussed. But 911 had to be called because she wasn't under hospice care and she wasn't in a hospital. And it ended up being like a crime scene, was how it felt to her community members taking care of her. This is a scenario that in Canada actually has a protocol now called EDIF. It's a wonderful name for it, EDIF, Expected Death in the Home Protocol. We don't yet have that here in the US. And so the expectation and the requirement for funeral homes is that they call 911 so that there can be an investigation. And obviously we want to protect ourselves against foul play and so forth. But there are a few things if the death is expected because of changes in health and there is an ongoing physician care, that if you do want to try to minimize the sense of intrusion from the police authorities, there are some ways to be a little bit better prepared and have that be less of kind of a secondary trauma happening. So there's more detail there. I'll also just give you a glimpse while I've got you on screen share here about the New Hampshire Funeral Resources and Education under green burial, these green burial cemeteries in the US and Canada. And as Jillian said, you can see that there are 418 listed around the country there. So the last thing that we wanted to do before transitioning into your questions, which you're welcome to start putting into the Q&A, is that Patrick and Jillian both have some thoughts on how you can get what you want and only what you want from working with a funeral home and a funeral director. Are you going to start us, Jillian?
Yeah, I can do that. So my advice would be to start calling around. I think that's probably the first step. See how you feel about a particular funeral provider by how they treat you on the phone. Does the person you're speaking to answer your questions? Does it sound like they know what they're talking about? Does it sound like they're fully listening to you? And if for whatever reason, if they can't give you the information that you're looking for, do they attempt to get it and then call you back? Or, if you've left a message for their funeral director, does the funeral director call you back when they say they will? Because I kind of think that communication is really, the starting point for getting what you want from a funeral director. My advice to you also is to kind of consider what sort of establishment you're calling. If you're looking for a provider based on price alone, there's like various models for how funeral services work. So if you're just looking for the lowest cost provider that you can find, there's sort of a trade-off there. I think that, that model is set up so that they're doing a high volume of business, with a low profit margin. But then, if there's a high volume of business, well, are you the priority? Is your family member the priority? Is your loved one, getting personalized attention and care? There's always a trade-off somewhere. I kind of think, especially with funeral providers, you kind of do, in some respects, get what you pay for. Patrick, do you have other thoughts as well?
whoops, kind of along those lines and getting what you pay for, you can request a price list. And so you can, so people aren't surprised at what things cost. There are a couple different, as Jillian mentioned, there are different types of funeral service providers. So you have that lowest cost option all the way up to, there are privately, independently owned funeral homes and there are corporate funeral homes. And there's a big difference between those along that spectrum and what prices are. So going and asking or calling and asking for a price list to get that information in advance, so you know what to expect. So it's not, for lack of a better term, sticker shock. So you want to have an understanding of, and then the funeral home, as well as if you're going to utilize a cemetery, those are different entities. So having an understanding of what both of them, what they charge. And then the cemetery is under different guidelines than a funeral home, so they can require some things. There are things that the funeral home can't require you to do, but there are different things that the cemetery can require that you have and do. I guess do you want me to go ahead on just sort of other things on price lists, Jillian, or did you have another thought?
No, I think that's a great idea. I would just say that, just in my experience, I find that a lot of the corporate run funeral homes are much more sales and revenue driven, and can be a little pushier in their approach. Whereas, in my experience, a family owned or independently owned provider, you're probably not going to get that kind of response from them. So.
When you get a general price list, just to it'll give you an idea, there's a thing at the top that says professional services, and that's a fee through the, federally, we cannot waive that fee unless there are 4 options. So if you're going to get well, not waive it, but there's a direct cremation, direct burial, receiving remains, and forwarding remains. So if you've died somewhere away from your home, there's a funeral home that's involved can be involved sending you to who you want to handle your final disposition. And then that funeral home that's receiving also has a cost. And so the professional services are discounted, and they're kind of in a all-in-one package, and it'll spell out exactly what you get in that package. Versus if you were going to go to the funeral home and say, okay, hey, I just want you to dress my loved one, or I just want you to do this and this. I'm looking at the price list. I'm going through the itemized items, and I'm just picking them off. Just so you're aware that basic professional services is in there, and that can't be waived. And then those itemized items are put into what you will pay. But then you still have some leeway of like, okay, Holly talked about blended services. You may say, we want to come in and bathe our loved one. We want to dress them. We want to place them in the casket. We want to provide our casket. As Holly mentioned, we you can go to Costco, you can go to Amazon, you can have someone build the casket for you. I would say talk with, I worked in the Gorge for about 5 years, so I had several people building caskets, which is awesome, but it's good to have a discussion maybe with your funeral provider about what things do we want to, how deep do we want it to be, what kind of handles. I've had some things that not go so well, where a well-meaning friend built the casket and it looked awesome, but it had some flaws because they didn't really talk about, it didn't fit in the grave liner because they made it really, really tall, and the grave liner at a cemetery is a certain standard, has certain standard dimensions, and we found out that it was too tall, so we had to do some. So that's totally fine if somebody's going to build it. I've seen some really amazing ones. It's just talking through that. Same with urns. I talked a little bit earlier. You don't have to purchase an urn. You can provide your own urn. It just depends on what's going to happen afterwards. You don't have to have a service at a funeral home, but do you want the funeral provider involved in some way, shape, or form at the church or other facility, or even coming into your home? So sometimes people are like, well, I don't need you to do this, this, and this, but I want you to do this. But if the funeral director is still involved, there may be a charge. And so it's having that discussion, like Jillian said, about asking questions and who's going to answer your questions, and ask them to explain the price list and what exactly am I looking at and what does this mean? How do I select? How do I know? Some funeral homes have packages that are kind of discounted if you get, this one traditional package or this graveside package, but other, like my funeral home, we've gone away from packages per se because they just didn't really cover everybody. So it was easier for families to choose what they wanted to choose versus just being stuck in a certain package. So really just having an understanding about the price list, discussing if you're going to use a cemetery, what their costs are. And the same with, we talked about the different types of funeral homes. There's also different types of cemeteries. Like there's Metro Pioneer Cemetery, which is run by the city. Their prices are very different than maybe, what Jillian's are at Riverview, or what maybe Lincoln Memorial is, which is a corporately owned cemetery. The prices are, again, huge spectrum.
And Patrick, I'm seeing we're starting to have quite a few questions coming in. So
Okay,
I don't want to
great.
cut you off, but I'm thinking we can start to head towards that transition. The last thing that I would add, in addition to both of your excellent tips, is that some people find it helpful to talk this through with a community-based educator or advocate. So earlier in the series, you met Evening Star end-of-life doulas, and also Jamie Thrower, who's an end-of-life doula. And for myself in that role, and also as a home funeral guide and as a funeral celebrant, a lot of times it's really about talking through what the vision, what the values are, helping to be a sounding board and pointing to some of these community-based sources of information, so that as a consumer, then you can have that basis of education and that sense of clarity about what you want to seek out, and then follow the kinds of suggestions that Jillian and Patrick have had.
And I just wanted to throw in, Holly, that doing it sooner than later, because trying to do that at the time of death you're already grieving, and then you're trying to figure out all of this information at the same time. So the earlier you can kind of start having those conversations, the better.
Yes, and I've heard many funeral directors say, even if you don't want to prepay and enter a contractual arrangement, you can open a file, you can do this fact finding, you can create your plan, and it can evolve over time, but at least you've gone through that values clarification exercise. Jillian?
Yeah, I was absolutely going to agree with you there. Just having the conversation, I think, is the most important part.